Hi, good afternoon. I have the distinct pleasure to speak after a party, so I have to like really amp get the buzz going again. So I'm going to start my talk today by talking a little bit about who I am and what motivates me as a marine ecologist. Now, to me, this picture epitomizes the lens in which I see my role as a scientist. In agreement with Jane Lubchenco, the celebrated marine ecologist and currently Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the White House, I see scientists as having an obligation to engage with society and to pursue and share knowledge that addresses society's most pressing problems. This is a scientist's social contract. The older man holding the young girl's hand symbolizes science's ability to make beneficial links between current and future generations through sustainable practices, while a group of people on the sand and a sailboat on the ocean represents the ecosystem goods and services that contribute to human well-being. And finally, the sun on the horizon signifies the possibility of science-based solutions yet to be discovered to increasingly more complex environmental challenges. Much of my work is therefore applied science that is solutions-based. Now, because I was born and raised in the Bahamas, the oceans have always been a really big part of my life. And so too are invasive species. My first introduction to invasive species occurred when I was very young. The casuarina trees you see in this photo are invasive throughout the world and are ubiquitous in the Bahamas, where they cause shoreline erosion. Many years later, I was confronted with the Indo-Pacific lionfish invasion of the Caribbean. The idea that a non-native species could wreak ecological havoc and dominate a land or seascape, however, was not new to me, as I've just shown. But what was different was I was finally in a position to do something about it, because at the time I was searching for a topic to study for graduate school. And so began my career studying invasive species in our oceans. Another focus of my research career thus far is the problem of overexploitation of marine resources. Fishing is of social and cultural importance in the Bahamas. In fact, the children you see in this photo fishing for fun are Israel and Amani, the children of my childhood friend. And the sign Fish Fry Drive that you see in this photo from a popular place for locals to socialize in the Bahamas literally refers to frying fish in a pan to eat. And finally, fishing is of economic importance in the Bahamas. Here we see a picture of the Caribbean spiny lobster, the most valuable fisheries export in the small island state. But many of these valuable resources are overexploited, and the typical Bahamian is aware of this simply by observing the rising prices and dropping availability of local seafood. However, it was not until I met Daniel Pauly at the University of British Columbia and the Sea Around Us project on reconstructing marine fisheries catches for the entire world that I get involved in digging up historical records to understand the true scope of fisheries exploitation through time. And finally, climate change affects us all, but particularly those in small island states like the Caribbean, which sits in a hurricane belt, where the intensity of storms are predicted to increase. What really drove me to get involved with this issue from a research perspective was when I observed the devastation caused by Category 5 Hurricane Dorian, which hit the Bahamas in 2019. Killing over 200 people, displacing tens of thousands more, and costing about $3.4 billion in damages, which is 1/4 of the Bahamas' GDP. Now, although I could not address the many complex social, political, and economic challenges of climate change, I could address the ecology of it. So I took what I knew best, which are invasive species in the oceans, and I thought seriously about how climate change may be affecting them, and in turn, biodiversity and the goods and services it provides to people. My motivation for studying 3 major drivers of global environmental change as it relates to the oceans is therefore deeply personal. In my talk, I'll briefly highlight some of my past, current, and future work that relates to these 3 human-caused stressors. As a cis woman of color from a small island's developing state, I recognize my intersectionality and the challenges that these overlapping identities sometimes bring when navigating the world of science. Near the end of this talk, I will also talk briefly about the need to diversify the fields of ecology and conservation. Now, starting with a roadmap of my talk, I'll first highlight some of my past and current work on reconstructing baselines of marine resource exploitation and overexploitation. Next, I'll give a snippet of my past work that examined, among other things, the ability of Native communities to resist invasions. Then I'll give an overview of some of my recent work as a postdoc at UBC, as well as a glimpse of some of the future work I hope to pursue as an assistant professor at Concordia University. And I just started this role literally May 1st. So it's all very new to me. Thank you. And finally, I'll close by talking about the need for and the benefits of diversifying ecology. Now, using the fisheries of the Bahamas as a case study, my research shows how reconstructing past patterns of marine resource exploitation and overexploitation can provide new baselines for marine resource management and conservation and offer novel insights into setting management targets and policy actions. Now, if you were to base current management strategies on officially reported catch statistics for the Bahamas, you would immediately picture this: a fleet of small-scale artisanal fishing vessels in Spanish Wells Ilustra, the largest fishing community in the Bahamas. But my research has shown that this is literally only half of the story. What you should also be thinking about is this: the massive volume of fish that is removed from Bahamian waters each year by tourists engaged in recreational fishing. Now, tourism became year-round in the Bahamas when it became, in the 1950s, believe it or not, when air conditioning was introduced to hotels. And since then, the number of visitors to the Bahamas each year has grown substantially, so that tourists now outnumber residents by an order of magnitude. Many of these tourists come to relax and enjoy sunbathing in beautiful places like this sandbar in Exuma Keys, the Bahamas. But thousands also come each year specifically to enjoy this: recreational fishing, in which fish are caught for pleasure and may or may not be consumed. Before I go any further, I'd like to show you this figure of officially reported catch data for the Bahamas, which comprises exclusively commercial fisheries. All other sectors, such as recreational fishing and subsistence fishing, are missing. Here we have time on the x-axis, but with fisheries catches in metric tons on the y. Now, these data are important because they are used to make management decisions both locally and internationally, and are submitted annually to the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, which records fisheries catches for the entire world. So how does one determine the importance of recreational fishing relative to other sectors when, like many countries, the Bahamas presently only accounts for commercial landings in their official statistics? Well, one solution is to use the established and widely applied catch reconstruction approach developed by Daniel Pauly and Dirk Zeller at UBC. In my work, I applied the 7 basic steps in catch reconstruction just shown here. In a nutshell, you first identify existing data, and then you identify missing components. Using alternative information sources, you basically link anchor points together by linearly interpolating between these points. And then you combine reported and unreported catch data, and then you express some level of uncertainty in the data sources by using a framework developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, to cut a very long story short, at the end of my reconstruction, I showed that the total amount of fish removed from Bahamian waters over the past half century was 2.6 times the officially reported catch. Even more alarming is the fact that recreational fishing, shown here in light green, accounted for more than half of total reconstructed catch, in which most unreported catch from the sector were taken by tourists, actually like 90-something%. Thus, by ignoring recreational catches in the Bahamas, you are literally missing half of the story on fishing. And I should point out that tourism represents about 51% of the Bahamas' GDP. So everything in the country you can link back to tourism in some way, whether it's energy consumption, food consumption, it all links back, land use. Anyway, my findings therefore debunk commonly held misperception in the Bahamas and globally that catches from recreational fishers are relatively small and therefore considered to be negligible when compared to other major sectors. Recreational catch constituted roughly half of reconstructed catch and is closely linked to tourism in a small island state. Furthermore, despite gear and bag limits, the large number of participants in this fishery results in significant impacts on species and stocks that are currently unaccounted for in official statistics. But my story does not end there. Who cares about historical ecology aside from scientists? Well, this story had a big impact on society. I believe that your work is not done when you publish a paper. Instead, you must also disseminate its findings in using popular media, for instance. And if you're lucky, you might even be able to influence policy. So after the publication of the study, I was invited by the Bahamian government to be part of the official delegation to attend a 32nd Committee of Fisheries in Rome at the UNFAO. There I presented my findings on the importance of recreational catch in the Bahamas at a side event on fishery statistics and its importance for food security. My reconstructed catch data were eventually officially endorsed by the Bahamian government and retroactively submitted to the FAO for the years 1950 through 2010. And I've updated that to, I think, about 2018 recently. In other words, this study literally rewrote the history of fishing in the Bahamas. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a bit. Now I'd like to show you a glimpse of my present work, which involves reconstructing the sponge fishery of the Bahamas. And this is a side project of mine because it's always been an interest of mine to look into historical ecology. Now we all know what a bass sponge is. But what you might not know is that in the past, marine sponges were used to line the helmets of soldiers in World War I. While in World War II, they were used to clean heavy machinery and as gun swabs. Now, despite there being over 1,000 genera of marine sponges, only 2 genera are commercially fished in the Caribbean. In its heyday in the early 1900s, the sponge fishery was the dominant industry in the Bahamas, surpassing even tourism. And the small island state was the second largest exporter of sponges in the world. There's a fascinating story of the history of sponging in the Bahamas, which spans almost 200 years and involves a shipwreck and humble beginnings, fantastic growth, and devastating collapse, followed by recent attempts to revive the industry in the 21st century. I won't go into detail about the history of this fishery today. Look out for my upcoming publication this year. But what I do want to show you is this incredible preliminary result. Now, this is a historical reconstruction of the fisheries, sponge fisheries in the Bahamas, where we have time on the x-axis and sponge catch in tons on the y. The different colors in the graph signify the different species of sponges. Now, many people attribute the decline in the sponging industry in the Bahamas to a variety of factors, but mainly due to the outbreak of a fungal disease, which was linked to killing between 70 to 95% of sponges in the Bahamas, and actually 99% of a particular species, the velvet sponge, which is now considered to be extinct, not even commercially extinct. No one has seen it. I mean, extinct in the Bahamas. No one has seen it in like 60 years. So anyway, this disease had a really big impact in the Bahamas before it spread to the rest of the Caribbean. However, as you can see from my reconstruction, the sponge industry had already declined substantially prior to this disease outbreak, which is highlighted by that red arrow there, which is represented by the red arrow. This is likely due to overexploitation and unsustainable harvesting practices. And I can kind of tell you how they harvested sponges in the past didn't allow for regeneration, but now those methods have changed. And so sponges can now regenerate once you remove them for fishing. But there's more to this story. In this figure, I've now overlaid major Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes that passed over the Bahamas during the period of the time reconstruction. Hurricanes also played a major role in the fisheries decline as they destroyed not only the sponge fishing beds, but also fisheries infrastructure, such as boats, docks, warehouses, and processing plants. In fact, some of the historical documents during this time describe the large number of sponging vessels that were destroyed, but also sponge fishermen that died while fishing for sponges during hurricanes, particularly during the early part of the time series when early warning systems for hurricanes weren't really great. And so literally they'll give you the name of the boat, the captain, and all the people that died while fishing during the storm, which is really tragic. Now, if you look closely at this figure, for some time periods, like the ones I've highlighted in the black box, there's a clear sudden drop in sponge exports that immediately follows a hurricane. I'm now in the process of modeling these data to determine what percentage of variation in sponge catches can be explained by hurricane damages. A final interesting point about this figure is that you can see a clear signature of the effects of climate change in which the intensity of storms are increasing. If you now pay attention to the strength of the hurricanes, in which Category 5 storms, the strongest level for hurricanes was sustained winds of 252 kilometers per hour. And if you remember, that was the storm that hit the Bahamas in 2019, causing all that damage. And we have Category 4 storms, which are weaker storms and have sustained winds of about 209 to 251 kilometers per hour, as shown in blue. We can see that for the first 140 years, only 2 Category 5 hurricanes went over the Bahamas. However, if we look for the last 40 years of this time series, that is a time period about 10 times smaller, we can see that the number of Category 5 hurricanes has literally doubled since 1980. All of this is to say that the diseases only added the finishing touches on a fishery that was already in decline for several reasons, some of which are ongoing. Okay, I put this beautiful picture of a reef in the Bahamas for us all to take a bit of a break as I change gears. Now, moving on to biological invasions, another substantial source of environmental change and biodiversity loss, I will now present one of my past studies that explored the notion of biotic resistance, or the ability of a native community to resist or limit the success of invasive species. Now, several factors are thought to confer biotic resistance. These include native diversity and native predators, competitors, pathogens, and parasites. Now, using the Indo-Pacific lionfish invasion on Caribbean coral reefs as a model system, I'll show how native predators can reduce the success of an invasive species through non-lethal means. Now, lionfish are native to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where they are coral reef mid-level predators on coral reefs and feed on a variety of crustaceans and fishes. They were first introduced into the Western Atlantic Ocean in the mid-1980s. And this is a map showing the sightings of lionfish throughout the Western Atlantic. And I want you to pay particular attention to when sightings hit the Bahamas in 2004, as things really begin to take off at that point. And this invasion is particularly important to me because, as I said before, I'm originally from the Bahamas, where we have some of the highest densities of lionfish in both the native and invaded ranges. Fast forward to 2023, and lionfish are now found as far north as North Carolina and as far south as the east coast of Brazil, although this somewhat dated map only shows the distribution as of May 2021. If you look closely at the map, you see that they go a bit further into like Long Island, New York. But remember, these are just sightings. And so what happens is lionfish juveniles will go up there with the Gulf Stream, the warm current, pushing them up there in the summer months. But in wintertime, the winter bottom temperatures are so cold that they die out. So it's not an established population. So the established population is Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and then further down to Brazil. And people are concerned about the lionfish invasion because they're incredibly effective predators. For instance, on some coral reefs in the Bahamas, natural coral reefs, not experimental reefs, they've caused 65% declines in native prey fish biomass. And it seems as if they have no natural control because they have these venomous spines. So you can imagine people surprised when this paper appeared in Coral Reef Journal, showing that large groupers can in fact eat small lionfish. However, this was an opportunistic observation involving only 6 groupers, 3 of which had small lionfish in their stomachs. And this point takes me to my question of whether native groupers can act as a form of biotic resistance to lionfish. Now, there is currently conflicting evidence about the nature of the relationship between lionfish and native groupers in the Caribbean. For example, at the local scale of a marine protected area in the Bahamas, lionfish biomass is found to be negatively correlated with grouper biomass, as shown here with grouper biomass on the x-axis and lionfish biomass on the y. However, at a much broader spatial scale, such as a study involving 3 ecoregions within the Caribbean, there was no relationship between lionfish and native grouper abundances. Now, unlike previous studies that looked at the correlation between lionfish and native grouper abundances, I decided to look for the answer straight from the grouper's mouth, so to speak. So to do this, I examined the stomach contents of over 200 large-bodied groupers caught by recreational and commercial fishermen, representing 6 species on 3 islands throughout the Bahamian archipelago. And what did I find? not a single lionfish, thus showing that there's little direct support for predation of groupers on lionfish as a means of population control. But direct consumption is only half of the effect that predators can have on potential prey. There is also a large body of literature that shows for strong non-consumptive or fair effects, in which the mere presence of predators can cause prey to alter their behaviors, so that it's more difficult for predators to detect, encounter, or capture prey. For instance, cats for the most part eat cat food, but mice will still be afraid and hide when cats are around. And this anti-predator behavior of mice comes at a cost, as mice that spend more time hiding presumably have less time to forage and mate. Now, some species of groupers in the Caribbean are of similar size and eat similar prey as lionfish, and can therefore potentially compete with lionfish on reefs as another form of biotic resistance. Now, I could examine the non-consumptive and competitive effects of native groupers on invasive lionfish by conducting a field experiment on coral reef patches around Eleuthera Island, the Bahamas, in which I exploited natural variability in grouper densities. And I tried to actually experimentally manipulate grouper densities, and I did that for a month before I stopped. And I found out that A, I was a really bad grouper fisher woman. And then B, when I did capture a grouper, they have these homing behaviors. So you capture the grouper and then it still leaves the reef, the experimental reef that you put it on. So I spoke to a lot of fishermen about how to get these groupers, and it was a learning experience and also a way to learn to pivot when things don't go the way you intended. Anyway, so I cleared all reefs of lionfish and replaced them with tagged juvenile lionfish that I collected from outside the study area. Each reef therefore contained 3 to 4 lionfish in which I could identify individuals. And you can see right there, those little circles, those are, you see the little red, a little small red dash, those are visible implant elastomer tags. And the cool things about those is that it's a liquid, right? And you have it in a syringe and you inject it right under the skin of a fish, and it solidifies really quickly. And you can tell individuals by the different color patterns and where you put them. And the cool thing about them is that the really cool thing, and the reason why I used this was that they glow really brightly under UV light. And because my studies took place at dawn, as well as it's like 1 hour before sunrise, you're in a reef and it's completely dark. The way you find individuals is you take out a UV underwater flashlight and you strobe the reef. And then suddenly these bright colors will flash out at you in different patterns. And I'm like, oh, that's LO225 over there under that reef. So that's why I use these tags and not like Floyd streamer tags or anything else that is typically used. Now, I monitor the abundances of groupers and native fish small enough to be lionfish prey on reefs every other week for 1.5 months using underwater visual surveys and transects. I also recorded a series of lionfish anti-predator behaviors on reefs every 30 seconds for 30 minutes per fish, per survey, both at dawn and throughout the day. Behavioral surveys also took place every other week for 1.5 months. I measured 3 anti-predator behaviors by lionfish. These were hiding, inactivity, and total swimming distance. Given time constraints, I'll only present the results looking at lionfish hiding. I also examined several factors that might influence lionfish behaviors. These included large body grouper predators based either on size or species, smaller body grouper competitors based only on size, and other lionfish, because lionfish continue to recolonize my reefs throughout the study period. So even though you started off with like no lionfish except for the ones that you put on the reef, by 2 days later, the recolonization rates are so quick that new individuals would show up. And of course, I also looked at time of day, one at dawn when both groupers and lionfish are usually hunting on reefs, and then of course throughout the day when both taxa are likely resting. Now, I looked at several lionfish anti-predator behaviors like hiding as shown here, and formulated numerous a priori hypotheses based on factors that I thought might influence lionfish behaviors. These hypotheses were rewritten as mixed effects models, which I then competed against each other using AIC corrected for small sample sizes. So for example, in this very basic model, I examined the effects of 2 factors on lionfish hiding at dawn. However, these are more than just factors, as I can also infer a mechanism from my models. So in this example, groupers identified based either on body size or species are acting as potential predators while smaller body groupers are acting as potential competitors of lionfish. So here's one of my key results. Specifically, after competing 20 candidate models related to lionfish hiding behavior, the top model turned out to be this very simple one, where we have grouper predator density based on size on the x-axis and the probability that lionfish are hiding at first sighting at dawn on the y. The bands represent 95% confidence intervals, while the points are jittered along the y-axis and indicate where the lionfish was observed hiding within a reef, signified by number 1, or out in the open, signified by 0. So it's kind of counterintuitive how I coded that. As you can see, the higher the grouper predator, I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. So as you can see, the higher the grouper predator density on reefs, the more likely a lionfish was to be hiding instead of hunting at dawn. Now, this model, there was 38% support in this model, which actually explains 60% of variation in lionfish hiding behavior on reefs. And you would think that this is driven mainly by that one little point, but it's not. I removed that point and reran the analysis, and you still get the same relationship. It's still significant, and it still explains a substantial number of lionfish hiding behaviors at dawn. Now, I won't show the results for the other lionfish behaviors that I measured, but suffice to say that lionfish were more likely to hide and be inactive at dawn when they should otherwise be hunting on reefs with higher abundances of groupers. Now, large groupers are overfished throughout most of the Caribbean. Actually, they're listed as an endangered species. The Nassau grouper, which is the most popular grouper, has just been listed as an endangered species in Florida. Anyway, so they're overfished, which can lead to give rise to bolder lionfish that are more effective predators on native prey, because you have this decrease in lionfish and groupers. So lionfish are more out there hunting as opposed to hiding. And that can, I wanted to see if that would scale down to actual fitness on lionfish to see if on lionfish to see if lionfish have spent more time hiding at slower growth rates than those that were able to eat. But unfortunately, when I went to go and capture the lionfish at the end of the study, it was really hard to find them, and some of them disappeared. And so the sample size was too small to look at somatic growth rates to see if that reduced feeding did in fact lead to slower growth rates. I'd also like to point out here that my study is one of the few that examines landscapes of fair and marine systems, because as reflected by the name, this concept is frequently investigated in terrestrial systems. Therefore, by testing theories developed in terrestrial systems in the ocean, I can test a generality. Oh, I'm supposed to say something else here. But taking a step back, what does this all mean in a broader sense of things? Well, large body predators are under the decline worldwide, but usually people only look at the loss of consumptive effects of predators on potential prey. My studies show that the loss of large body predators can also lead to non-consumptive effects, which can alter not just the demographics of prey, but can alter their behaviors. Okay, let's take another breather, which I obviously need, and take another picture of a reef in the Bahamas. I'll now touch on some of my recent work as a postdoc at UBC involving climate change effects on invasive species, and then highlight some of the work I'll pursue at Concordia University as an assistant professor. Now, the oceans absorb between 20 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions generated by human activity and 90% of the excess heat produced by greenhouse warming. Now, this results in a series of physical changes that affect oceans in various ways, from rising sea levels and increasing sea temperatures to changes in ocean circulation, decreasing pH, dropping oxygen levels, changes in salinity, and increases in extreme events like heat waves and hurricanes. At the same time, due to the accelerating rate of global trade and travel, both the magnitude and the rate of biological invasions are increasing. Our world is more interconnected than ever before, leading to increased opportunities for species to invade regions beyond their natural range. And in fact, it has been estimated that the number of established non-native species per continent is going to increase by about 36% between 2006 and 2050. An important question, therefore, is what happens when these two major drivers of global environmental change collide? I approach this general question by looking at the effects of climate change on invasive species. Specifically, to address the gap in quantitative evidence of the effects of climate change on invasive species, I conducted a systematic global meta-analysis focusing exclusively on marine systems by examining over 2,000 publications drawn from two separate bibliographic databases on the matter. After applying a series of a priori inclusion and exclusion criteria, it included simple things such as, was it written in English? Was it done in a marine system? And importantly, did they actually quantify a biological effect? I ended up with only 16 publications that met all those criteria, but that resulted in about 67 studies because publications had multiple studies within them. They were pretty large publications. Now, I had several research questions, starting with the first one. Are there invasion hotspots based on this data set? Now, this question can be viewed in two ways. First, are there certain areas of the world more likely to be a source or a donor of invasive species? And second, are there certain regions of the world more likely to be recipients of invasive species? Starting with the first question, this map depicts the marine ecoregions of the world in which invasive species in the meta-analysis originated. Here, the color of the marine ecoregion represents the number of invasive species that came from that region in the meta-analysis. As you can see, Asia, namely Japan, appears to be a hotspot for contributing invasive species. And this may have something to do with Japan being the third largest economy in the world, where a lot of shipping activity takes place. Unfortunately, I can't present you the results for regions that are more likely to receive marine invasive species because I'm still actually working on this study. But the answers will probably let us know where we need to increase marine biosecurity measures. Moving on to my second and more general question, does climate change facilitate invasions? Now here I show a coefficient plot that I'll use frequently throughout this talk, where points represent effect sizes bounded by 95% confidence intervals. Points to the right of the dashed line mean invader success increased under climate change, whereas points to the left of the dashed line mean invader success decreased under climate change. Obviously, as you all know, if the confidence intervals cross the dashed line at 0, the result is not significant. And the little numbers you see in brackets are the sample size, or the number of studies included in the analysis. And then the colors represent temporal scale. And unfortunately, temporal scale relates perfectly to study type in this analysis, which is not surprising that experiments take place on small timescales, models on large timescales, and observational studies somewhere in the middle. So these two variables are confounded in my analysis. So you'll see me talk about both of them when I discuss results, because I can't disentangle what it is. Now, breaking down this general result into more specific, oh, I forgot to tell you what happened. Yes, so basically, there was a general trend for invader success to increase in the climate change, as you can see here, but the magnitude and significance varied by study type and our temporal scale. So this kind of shows quantitatively what lots of people have been talking about, but no one's been able to demonstrate, which is there an overall pattern for invasive species success to increase with climate change? Now, breaking down this general result into more specific questions, I then asked which stage of the invasion process is most strongly affected by climate change. Now, for those of you who may be less familiar with the stages of invasion, there are basically 5 stages, passing from introduction of a new species to the colonization of a new area, to the establishment of viable self-sustaining populations, to natural range expansion or spread throughout a new area, and finally to impact. Although the impact of an invader is felt throughout all stages of the invasion process, impact becomes most noticeable when the invader is both widespread and abundant. So I don't want you to think that this is mutually exclusive. It's not. Now here I present a series of coefficient plots that will get progressively larger as I move through the study questions. Starting with just invasion stage is shown by row in this plot, while study type or temporal scale is shown by columns in this plot. No study type examined all stages of the invasion process in large enough numbers to warrant statistical analyses. So here I present only the stages with large enough sample sizes per study type. Generally, the magnitude of the effect of climate change on invasive species on invasive species increase with time or among study types. If you look at the actual range or the scale of the x-axis there as we move along from experiments to models. However, although there's a general trend for the success of invasive species to increase at all stages of the invasion process, the effect was only significant over the short term for the colonization stage in experiments. Now, there are several measures of invasion success. I therefore asked which measure is most strongly affected by climate change. I decided on 6 biological indicators of invasion success based on the literature, and these were abundance, demography, distribution, per capita impact on native species, performance, such as changes in growth rates or increases in heat shock protein expression, and finally, changes in phenology that resulted in a benefit to the invasive species. So I've now added a second row to this figure, which represents the various biological responses of invasive species to climate change among the different study types or temporal scales. Once again, not all possible responses of the invader to climate change were covered by all study types and large enough sample sizes. So I've only presented the ones here where there were big enough sample sizes. As you can see, invader success tended to increase under climate change for all measures, but only increases in invader abundance over the short to medium term were significant in experiments and observational studies. And this is important because there was a meta-analysis that was done a while ago, maybe 10 years ago, and they were showing that there was really no effect of climate change on invasive species, but they only looked at invasive species performance. But if you'd looked at another measure, for instance, like abundance, you would have seen a significant effect. So what measure you use is actually really important in terms of what conclusion you may come to. That's why I looked at all measures. Finally, I asked what climate stressor or stressors elicit the largest responses in invasive species. Because as we know, climate change is not some nebulous concept, but instead is a combination of distinct physical changes. Now, I encountered studies addressing 4 different climate stressors in my meta-analysis. These were ocean acidification, extreme events, namely hurricanes and heat waves, ocean warming, and seawater freshening. Despite 4 stresses being covered by studies in my meta-analysis, I was only able to examine the effects of 2 stresses in experiments and observational studies, as shown by the last row in this figure. Models or long-term studies could not be included because every single study on models only looked at ocean warming. In general, both ocean warming and extreme events tended to increase the success of invasive species, with effects being generally greater in the medium term in observational studies than in the short term in experiments. However, when we look at which results are significant, this interesting pattern emerges in which, although over the short term, extreme events had a significant positive effect on invasive species, in the medium term, it's actually ocean warming that's going to have the bigger effect on invader success. So to sum up that little section there, I want to emphasize before I go on that the answers here are based only on the data set that I look at, and those answers might change as more data becomes available. Nevertheless, I found that there was a hotspot for invasive species in terms of donor regions, and this was Japan. Climate change generally facilitates marine invasions, in which colonization and abundances seem to be the most strongly affected. And finally, both extreme events and ocean warming had significant positive effects on invader success, but it depended on temporal scale and our study type. Okay, let's take a moment to look to the future at some of the things I hope to accomplish with students at Concordia. Now, ultimately, I'm interested in responses of invasive species to climate change in the oceans and its effects on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and thereby the goods and services that people rely on for a sustainable future. I'm also interested in system attributes that confer resilience to ocean ecosystems in the face of these disruptions, as well as human interventions that can promote these attributes, which in turn affect ecosystem resilience and ocean sustainability. This conceptual diagram helps me to develop all of my research questions. However, I know that there are far more comprehensive diagrams out there, and this is just to help me link all of my questions together. Now, my research is framed by five interconnected questions. Obviously, I won't talk about all 5 of them here today. I'll just focus on the first one. So my first question covers the first branch of my conceptual diagram in the red box, and this is, can invasive traits predict the types of responses of invasive species to climate change? So for example, here are the performance curves for 3 invasive species designated in purple, orange, and red, while the gray band represents the current limiting temperature, such as maximum summer surface temperature, water temperatures. As this mean shifts to the right with climate change, the purple invasive species is expected to decline, while the red and orange invasive species are expected to thrive. It's obviously impossible to derive performance curves for every single invasive species. So it'd be useful if we could be able to predict which traits told us which species would thrive or which ones wouldn't under climate change. It might be that, for instance, the red and orange species have some trait that they share that explains why the optimal temperatures are higher. For example, the red or orange invasive species could be the Pacific oyster, which is farmed in aquaculture, pretty commonly farmed in aquaculture, but is also invasive in many parts of the world. Now, the Pacific oyster has several spawning strategies, which are all associated with different phytoplankton blooming scenarios that are linked to warming temperatures. And what they found, at least modeling for specific oysters in Europe and like in Germany and so forth, they found that with warming temperatures, oysters in aquaculture, they thought that they wouldn't escape out into the wild because they couldn't reproduce. But with the warming water temperatures, they'll now be able to complete their life cycle. And the thing about this is that with the warming temperatures, oysters exhibit like 3 different spawning strategies. But with warming temperatures, they're more likely, it went from a smaller percentage, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, that did synchronous spawning to basically 100% of the population doing synchronous spawning by the year 2100. And that's the most effective strategy for colonization success. And as I've shown in my meta-analysis, the stage that's going to be most greatly affected by climate change is colonization. So the point is, this red or this orange species could be something like the oyster in Europe. Now, these are the sorts of questions that I intend to pursue at my new lab, which I've named Drivers of Environmental Change in the Oceans Lab, or the DECO lab for short, like Art Deco. I thought that was cool. So if you're interested in going to graduate school in Canada or being a postdoc in Canada, please, and these questions sort of pique your interest, please feel free to contact me. And so to conclude the ecological research section of my talk, my work spans 3 of the major drivers of global environmental change in the oceans and examines some of the interactions between these major stressors. I aim to produce applied, rigorous research informed by a strong theoretical foundation that addresses some of society's most pressing environmental issues. Furthermore, by communicating my findings to policymakers and the public at large, I hope to give our oceans and the people that rely on them a sustainable future. So this is the last photo I'm going to show you, a beautiful tarpon in the Bahamas. I will now close off by briefly talking about the need to diversify the field of ecology. Now, like most people, I've encountered numerous challenges during my PhD. However, the one thing that nearly drove me to quitting my PhD and leaving the field of ecology altogether, at least as it relates to the academy, is my increasing sense of isolation as I climbed higher and higher in this ladder of achievement. I saw less and less people that looked like me. And I was the only Black student in my PhD program. And when I left, the number dropped to 0, and it remains to 0 to this day right now. And so it's because of these feelings of marginalization that I became a strong advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion along all dimensions in marine conservation and ecology. Because it really does do something to you psychologically when you see this. Because you're like, should I be inhabiting these spaces? You start to think. So we all know that science, and particularly ecology, has a diversity problem, and that women, people of color, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, and disabled scientists are sometimes discriminated against. Now, this point has been made time and time again. Now, aside from creating a more just and equitable society for all, why do these findings matter? Well, because who does the science matters. Personal backgrounds and identities influence what sorts of questions are asked in science, what sorts of questions are funded in science, and what sorts of solutions are proposed. Now, I don't have sufficient time to illustrate each one of these points, so I'll focus only on the third one today. Now, this article was published in Science just recently on May 19th of this year by Clayton Lamb, who is my really good friend from my previous postdoc fellowship. And although this our article is not a marine example, it speaks more broadly to the field of conservation ecology. I think it brilliantly illustrates my third point about it matters who does science in terms of what types of solutions you'll come up with. So using the woodland caribou as an example, Lamb and colleagues asserted that current endangered species laws promote inequities in biodiversity conservation and policies. Specifically, they argued that endangered species laws in both Canada and the US effectively prevent species extinctions, but do not restore culturally meaningful abundances for Indigenous peoples. So as a case in point, caribou were once so abundant in British Columbia that the elders from the Treaty Number 8 adherent West Moberly First Nations tribe said that the Klinzak caribou subpopulation were like bugs on the landscape. However, by 2013, there are only 38 individuals left in this population. Now, Indigenous-led efforts to recover the threatened Klinzak population had more than tripled the caribou abundance in about 8 years, which averts certain extinction, according to Western science metrics of minimal viable population, as set in place by the Canadian government, which estimates that you need about just a little over 100 individuals in order to avert disaster. However, this number is far below levels at which First Nations people can participate in culturally meaningful harvests. To illustrate this point, 114 caribou would produce only about 3 caribou annually for sustainable Indigenous harvests, which does not meet historical levels of use by the community. If you wish to provide just 1 meal per year for each of the 1,600 members of the First Nation, this would amount to about 6 caribou that would be sustainably harvested per year, thereby requiring a population of about 200 caribou. But if you wish to provide meaningful cultural engagement and local food security, you would need about 15 meals per person per year based on caribou. And this would require about 3,000 caribou, which is more reflective of the historic bugs on the landscape number that First Nations elders talked about. So from this very simple example, one can clearly see why it matters who does science and who's sitting at the table when the science is put forward as policymakers. As a local Indigenous conservation biologist would have likely brought a perspective that would have caught this oversight by just Western scientists. So in other words, for solutions-based science to work effectively, you need to include all stakeholders in the process. And with that, I'd like to end by thanking my funding agencies and lots of people that helped me along the way. And are there any questions? Yes, Juliet?
I'm curious to know how experimental designs in your meta-analysis about climate change on species invasion, how the observational studies compare the ethics of climate change? What was their control?
So for that, what they did was they looked at really long time series and they would match that. I'm trying to remember because I did this over a year ago. They would match that with for instance, temperature data over that same time period, and they would show that in this time period when temperature was this average, invasive species were doing X. But when the temperature changed, suddenly invasive species abundances went way up, or they spread to these other areas where they weren't before. The only thing that seems to have changed is the temperature. And the things with invasive species, a lot of them aren't harvested, so you don't really have that interaction of saying, well, did harvest practices or technology change? So they looked at things like that. And they were over like, when I'm talking about long time periods, I'm talking like 100 years, they would look at zooplankton communities and then kind of see what happened when the temperature changed and then look for another long time period. And that's how that's roughly how I can remember how they did this. But like, this is like over 2,000 papers I went through. So it's all a mush at this point. Yes.
Can you go back to the slide that you had with the sponge harvest and the disease?
Mm-hmm. Is there a faster way to find this? Okay, I don't think there is. Let me just.
I apologize for me.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't find a little mouse that will allow me to skip through it. Okay,
Yeah, okay.
this one or the one before?
That'll do.
Okay.
Either one. My first hypothesis was that the disease would occur when the population was very high. But in fact, the disease occurred after harvesting was very high. So that kind of destroys my first hypothesis. And then I was wondering if we know anything about diseases of organisms after the really healthy ones have been harvested and the ones that are left are in more positions where they don't get very much food, and maybe disease is more likely when the population
It's
has
smaller.
been over harvested and the ones that are left are of marginal health. I don't know if anybody has looked at the hypothesis that disease is more likely when the population is high, or disease is more likely when it's a marginal population. And then it really occurred to me that nobody was harvesting them, maybe nobody paid any attention to whether there was disease or not. But is there any general relationship about you can expect disease when the population is overcrowded? Or?
Well, usually, I mean, like traditional ecology, how I've been trained would tell me that, density dependent factors such as disease would kick in when the population is very high. Because, crowding increases disease transmission. But yeah, when I look at these data, I start to wonder. But another thing that I haven't talked about, which I can't test with this data, but hurricanes, when they come through, what they do is they also take land-based pollutants and move it into the ocean. And some of those can actually cause like fungal diseases and so forth that can. So, but
Yeah, I think on your other slide, you're actually showing the hurricane.
Yeah, like you see how you see the great Nassau hurricane of 1926 and then see how big it drops. And then if OB, whatever, it drops again really. And then the funny thing is that they put a moratorium on harvesting. The British government, because this was still a colony at the day, this is where I got all my data, was from British colonial records, export data. They put a moratorium on harvesting sponges and they still really didn't bounce back much. Yeah, and the moratorium was around like 1940s right there. You see there's hardly no harvesting going on. And then there was a little bit of harvesting. And then the other thing what happened was the introduction of the artificial sponge came about in the 1950s. So demand also went down. So there's a lot of factors playing in there. But then one thing I do know for sure is that disease wiped out the velvet sponge in the Bahamas into the States, never been seen again. And that was the most commercially valuable sponge. And also if you look here, that was the one that was harvested the most. Yes.
Yeah, Rachel, I have a question going right back to the beginning. I won't ask you to go all the way back in the slides. But I was really interested that the Bahamas government accepted and the cap reconstruction and updated the FAOs. Pretty unusual actually for countries to do that. But what I was really interested in was, given the government now knows their catches are far bigger than they've had before, has there been any attempt to consider actually regulating the tourism industry, given its value? And I guess I come from other countries where the answer to that question is always no.
Yes, absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. Yeah. I said the problem is too about how fisheries is managed in the Bahamas is that, which is like really crazy, is that the fishing permits are actually given out, not in the fishery. So the Department of Fisheries has no idea how many fishing permits are given out to tourists each year, because the permits are given out by the Customs Department that gives them the tourists, it gives them a cruising permit, which allows you to also fish. And so and I went to the Department of Fisheries for a very simple number, which is like how many tourists get recreational licenses to fish each year. They were like, I don't know. And then I went to the Department of Statistics, because what they're supposed to do is each ministry is supposed to send annual reports to the Department of Statistics. I went to those fellows and they said, well, they only gave us a report once, and that was in 1979. So we have no idea how much. And so what I had to do was to go back to reconstruct a recreational catch. Was that the one place where we get really good data is the tourism industry, because, you know, that's a bread and butter. So I went to the Ministry of Tourism, went into their records, and I showed very detailed how many tourists came to the Bahamas each year. But then they give them these activity surveys as well. So it tells you what percentage of these people, depending on what island they were on, engaged in recreational fishing. So then I had at least a number of, you know, permits per se, because these are the people that are actually fishing. And then from that, you can look at the laws for fishing and say, you know, if you take per capita catch limits and say, let's be conservative and assume people only caught about 80% of the catch limit, which you might think is a lot, but it's not when I spoke to lots of fisheries managers and regulators, because although they have these catch limits, it's not monitored. And so people actually commercial fish in the Bahamas under recreational fishing, particularly in Florida. A lot of the catch you'll see in Florida docks is actually landed in the Bahamas and then brought over to Florida. So that was a conservative estimate. So basically those figures you saw for recreational fishing, that's if everyone followed the rules and only caught about 80% of what the law was legally allowing them to get. And when you see those big sudden drops in the catch, that's when the laws will change suddenly to account for lower catch limits. So each time the law changed in the legislation, I readjusted the numbers. But yeah, the Bahamas, they won't touch that. That's like the elephant in the room, because no one wants to disturb the tourism industry, despite its effects on the fisheries industry. And I want to point out too that although the Bahamian government endorsed the statistics and sent it to the FAO, I'm not sure if the FAO actually updated their data set. So it might just be sitting on someone's desk somewhere, and the numbers will probably never be updated. I'm not sure, unless the government kind of pushes back on that. But I've just kind of like moved on from that and looked at climate change and invasive species. Yes.
And thank you for your talk. That's such an interesting knowledge gap and also management issue on the tourism. But going back to your invasive species studies, I am curious to hear more about why you think there are these significant trends in invasions becoming, or colonizations, for example, becoming more likely with farming. I mean, I think of potential hypotheses, but like you showed that certain species are coming into their more ideal temperature range, while others are leaving their ideal temperature range. I'm just curious what you think are some of the problems.
Well, so the main hypothesis that people have about why invasive species are going to perform better under climate change is because they have a lot of the traits that would allow them to perform great under climate change. For instance, most invasive species are environmental generalists. So they can sustain broader environmental tolerances than most native species. And then secondly, a lot of invasive species have these, what do we call them? Not priority effects. I'm forgetting the term that they use for species that colonize really quickly after a disturbance, have high fecundity, fast growth rates. There's a specific ecological term for that. I can't remember at the moment, but pardon me? Not R-selected. It was pioneer. There we go. Pioneering species. Yeah. Pioneering species. And so when you have climate change, a lot of the big disturbances you're going to have, if you have hurricanes come through, it's going to wipe clean the slate. And then those pioneering species, which happen to be invasive, are going to come in. Like for instance, in Florida, I'll never forget this study, not Florida, Puerto Rico. They showed that before Hurricane Maria or Irene, anyway, I can't remember the name, but it was a woman's name for the hurricane this year. And there was none of this invasive algae there, none whatsoever. And they did surveys. And then after the hurricane, not only was that algae present, but it dominated the seascape. Most of the native algae had died out, and the invasive algae had just taken over all the space. And so it's because they have these pioneering life history characteristics that allow them to like really capitalize on some of those big changes by that are happening under climate change. And so there's that and a whole bunch of other reasons why, for instance, there's something called sleeper species. And these are species that are non-native and they're sitting in an environment and everything is fine right now because they can't really complete their life cycle or whatever to become invasive and spread because of some limiting climate factor. But when that climate factor changes, it kind of basically wakes the sleeper and it becomes invasive. And the example I'd use for that was the Pacific oyster in Europe, where in aquaculture, they thought they were good because it couldn't complete its life cycle, but now with warming temperatures, it can. And so suddenly it's spreading all over the place. And the tourism industry is kind of pissed off with that because when you have that oyster beds, it's not good for tourists want to walk on the beach and this sort of thing, as well as outcompeting the native species and this sort of thing. So yeah, so there's sleeper species as well that would perform under climate change. So yeah, there's the whole list of reasons why that I can't remember off the top of my head that invaders would do better under climate change. Yes.
So are Pacific oysters as an invasive species and like Germany actually expecting to do much better under climate change? So I know like here, oyster growers are really worried about climate change impacts Pacific oysters.
I don't know. Because like I said, I wasn't researching that in any detail. It's just kind of like I'm reading through and then it jumps in my head. Oh, this is a sleeper species sort of thing. But I not any single taxa have I gone into great detail about because it was more of a broad look at the whole field when you do a meta-analysis. I haven't zoned in on any particular study, but that's a really good question because, you know, like we were talking about at lunchtime where sometimes if the native species are wiped out and an invasive species can replace an ecological service, an ecosystem service that the native species had, then, you know, is at that point that you accept the invader. And like I said, there's a big debate that's going on in the invasion field about this right now. And Julie Lockwood just published a paper like last week that talks about a rebuttal to some people's perspectives on that. So I want to read that and see what she says and kind of, I have no opinion because I don't know the field well enough, like until I read everyone's opinion and their evidence they put forward. And then at that point, I form an opinion. So right now I'm still at the point of reading the evidence that people put forward. Yes.
So I really appreciate your bringing DEI and conclusion at the end. And I have a question for you. Is there something in particular where you felt like you did experience inclusion in one of the academic environments that could be replicated elsewhere? Are there some lessons we can learn? Is it bottom up? Is it top down? You know.
Well, one of the things in which I felt incredibly empowered was actually just this January. There's this group called Black Women in Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Sciences, and they had a conference in January. And so it brought in women from all over, mainly the US and some of Canada and some of the Caribbean. And they all came together in South America as well. And we had like a little conference. And so everyone presented their work and their research. And it was like, wow, this is a room all filled with people that are doing things that I'm passionate about and that look like me. And we are out there, even though you're just little dots on the landscape. And that was an incredibly empowering sort of experience. And then from that, what we also did was not just a conference, but we had things like, we even had a yoga session. So, you know, mental health breaks and this sort of thing, and just opportunities to bond. And we had a whole dance out, you know, like, so everyone, like we had a dance party and yeah, it was crazy, but that was a really good turning moment for me when I saw that.
With that, let's thank our speaker.